Chapter 7, Youth, Rock Without Roll. Just because we dig Jimi Hendrix doesn't mean we are any less ready to fight for our country. Young Russian rock fan, 1974. Rock, hard rock, live, that unmistakable driving, pulsating rock beat, amplifiers way up. A kid in a leather jacket works the dials and periodically dashes halfway up the aisle to check the decibels. Tall, lanky Valerie Vernegor belts out Evil Woman and Spinning Wheel, hits made famous by the American group Blood, Sweat, and Tears. He sings with feeling. In English, it could be the original except for sharp, brassy riffs from trumpets and trombones. At the electronic organ, throbbing with rhythm, is a goateed dandy in a flaming red shirt. The drummer, lean and intense, is developing a handlebar mustache. A bank of electric guitarmen in neck-length hair give out with the vacant-eyed look and rolling body motion that go with rock. At center stage, Lyosha Kozlov, with stringy beatnik hair and a full Solzhenitsyn beard, works over a wild, rippling alto sax. The room swims in sound, then sharp, enthusiastic applause all around me, and Makuradad Badi, a Moscow horn Persian lad with a high wavering tenor and kinky hair falling to his shoulders, joins in a medley from Jesus Christ Superstar. Almost anywhere else in the world this scene may be standard, but this was Moscow, March 74. Not the underworld exactly, but a libertine delight savored surreptitiously. A crowd, 400 strong, mostly young, on a Thursday afternoon, packed into a nondescript meeting hall, lost somewhere in the sprawling and pretentious exhibition grounds built by Stalin to advertise the achievements of the national economy. Not only was the setting improbable for live rock, so is Alexei Kozlov, the combo's leader. Lyosha, to his friends, is one of those intriguing Russians who live double lives because their real passions are taboo or borderline. Abstract artists who design theater sets or do graphic illustrations for a living, sculptors with a bent for religious figurines, or pornographic metal sculpture who earn handsome commissions doing tombstones for the high and mighty, satirists who live off writing children's fairy tales, a jazz piano teacher whose regular job is assistant professor of automation and telemechanics at Moscow Physical Engineering Institute, which founded and still sponsors the Moscow Jazz School, evidently because more appropriate institutions were not prepared to embrace jazz. Kozlov himself is an architect by training. Since '62, his official employment has been as specialist in industrial design at the All-Union Research Institute for Technical Aesthetics. He is also Moscow's top freelance jazz rock musician, a man now in his early 40s who began listening to Western radio broadcasts of jazz in the early 50s and has experimented with Dixieland, swing, hot jazz, bebop, cool jazz, rock, and is now developing his own style. For years, he had to practice in places where people, including his parents, did not go for the Western sound, so he sewed himself a heavy velvet bag with 3 holes in it, one for the mouthpiece and one for each hand. He stuck his saxophone inside the bag and then like a bagpipe player, tooted away at his muffled sax with less bother to the neighbors. On stage, he is alive with music, directing his own arrangements and compositions. When he is not playing that slithery saxophone off stage, he is so relaxed he looks as if he had no bones. I economize all my energy to put it into playing, is his explanation. Modest of build and manner, Leosha doesn't drink much and doesn't smoke, but plays cards seriously. The way he plays music in the 60s, he played saxophone in several Soviet stage bands, which are still doing 50s-style dance music, and was sent by the Young Communist League to the Warsaw Jazz Jamboree in November of '62 as a Soviet representative, but gradually Leosha Kozlov has drifted away from official music. Once in the mid-60s, Leonid Pereverzev, a sonic engineer whose love and encyclopedic knowledge of jazz has made him a leading commentator, gave a jazz lecture on Moscow television, illustrated with pre-taped numbers by an earlier, milder Kozlov combo. But the editors, as one musician put it delicately, snipped out one number because the swaying, rhythmic gyrations of Kozlov and his musicians were deemed too unorthodox and suggestive. Kozlov drifted further away from officially approved pop music and is now guru to young musicians, some of them classical musical students at Moscow Conservatory, who want to master rock. Actually, what Kozlov creates is a hybrid of jazz and rock, a combination of the heavy, rhythmic drive and loud electronic acoustic of rock with jazz improvisation and brass techniques from the big band era. Russian youth obviously dig what he does, but he must tread carefully. During my years in Moscow, his music was not banned, but it was officially regarded as shady. So sought after is the Kozlov group by youth in the know that even though it is strictly unofficial, essentially non-profit, and totally unadvertised, it plays 15 to 20 concerts a year, each one privately organized and carefully arranged for a closed audience, like the concert I saw at the fairgrounds. Invitations come from young auto workers, mining engineers, technical designers, Oil Institute students, and groups in cities like Donetsk, Dnepropetrovsk, and Kuibyshev, where sometimes the unknowing authorities are less politically stingy about music than Moscow bosses. But Kozlov is careful not to let things get out of hand and spoil the music. Once in late '74, an enthusiastic audience at the Moscow House of Scientists began cheering and shouting in the tradition of rock audiences the world over, but well in excess of Soviet norms. Kozlov politely asked them to go easy. I consider rock a branch of contemporary academic music, he cautioned. We are trying to treat it that way, so we ask you to react to it in the same spirit. The audience got his message. Moreover, the lid is on for the general public. Outside the aficionados, the Russian public is unaware of Kozlov's existence. Catching one of his concerts, like getting in on almost any of the more interesting subterranean happenings in Russia, is like spotting a shooting star. It flashes across the heavens briefly. If you happen to be outside on the right night at the right time and looking in the right direction, you see it, but otherwise at all other moments the sky looks normal and you'd swear there were no shooting stars. With Kozlov's music, you need a tip in advance, and also the connections to wangle your way in. What is striking to me, however, is that the Soviet youth scene today is studded with would-be Kozlovs and little combos all over the country, because pop culture has seeped right through the ideological walls that conservative elders have tried to erect. Generalizing about Soviet youth is an impossible, and generalizing about American youth. In sophistication and lifestyle, a university student from a prominent foreign-traveling Moscow family is a world apart from a young factory worker in Ryazan, only about 100 miles down the road, but still provincial and isolated, let alone the rough youth in the far north or a Siberian village. The one language that comes closest to speaking to all of them is pop music. Back in '72, the newspaper Soviet Culture carried a letter from a girl in Kubyashev saying, "The Beatles are understood by and are close to millions of my contemporaries." 3 young men from Gorky indicated how badly they ached for a change of pace from the diet of patriotic music. Red Army marches and semi-operatic ballads fed them on Soviet radio and television. "We young people need recreation, and light recreation at that," they wrote. "There is scientific and technological progress. One has to keep in step with everything. How can you suggest our singing ballads and listening to marches under a difficult, strenuous day? Traveling across the Soviet Union, I have run into pop groups or beat groups. Rock remains too explosive a word for official Soviets. Not only in cities like Moscow, Leningrad, Riga, or Tallinn, but in once Islamic city of Bukhara in Central Asia or in Siberia, 10,000 miles from New York. In Bratsk, one group that I met had put together a large library of tapings from Voice of America. This was while VOA was still being jammed, of the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Jefferson Airplane, Engelbert Humperdinck, and other Western stars. None of them really understood English, but they happily and skillfully mimicked the English lyrics, and disc jockeys so up were they on Western rock idols that they peppered me with questions about the private lives of stars I had never heard of, and then excitedly got me to help them transcribe the words to a recording of Malia Jackson's "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands." I don't think they had the vaguest idea it was a jazzed-up rendition of a spiritual. What interested them was not the message, but the music, and what they played privately for their own enjoyment was far different from what they were allowed to play in public. For after discovering that Stonewall resistance to Western pop culture simply would not work, Soviet authorities have compromised on more sophisticated methods for siphoning off the downbeat urges of their young. In the 60s, pop groups began sprouting under official sponsorship at factories, institutes, universities, and local palaces of culture, as Russians call pompously their community centers. But pop groups like Dachas run the gamut. They range from the bland, loyal, and uninteresting majority to the far-out, authentic rock of the Kozlov combo. The tamer variety are encouraged to take part in nationwide talent hunts, with local and regional competitions building up to the nationally televised playoff. But their repertoire and lyrics, even their dress movements and their politics, I was told by several young musicians, are monitored, vetted, and purged of anything that is morally, sexually, or politically suggestive. Often innocent tunes whose only flaw is their Western parentage are dropped. When some provincial groups audition for television, a hip young guitarist said, they are told they have to do the agate prop songs. about economic achievement and space heroes, adapted to the modern idiom since they need official affiliation to get a place to rehearse or the right to perform, and sometimes even to obtain certain instruments they bow to controls. The irony is that the more proficient and professional pop groups become, the more they are controlled and co-opted, the guitarist said. For that reason, he had no intention of turning pro, though he was talented enough to make it in the West. From others I heard that the best groups are in the academic institutes, unknown amateurs with flamboyant names like the Time Machine, the Violent Catastrophe, the Ruby Attack, rather than the professional groups with tepid names and official repertoires like the Singing Guitars, the Jolly Guys, or the Troubadours. These professionals are recorded but far less well known and less followed than the imported Western rock sounds. The reason, according to the guitarist, is that professional Soviet combos cannot show their stuff on television, he said. They are forbidden to use their loudest, best amplifying equipment to keep their music from being too wild. In concerts, they are given a quota on how much Western music they can play, typically 15%, because they have to play 65% Soviet compositions and 20% Eastern European. Equally crippling is the refusal of music monitors of the Komsomol and Ministry of Culture to permit groups to play their own composition on grounds that these tunes were not written by official, regime-approved composers. Nor has detente helped things much. In Tallinn, the most open of Soviet cities, a restaurant band pianist told me that officials were becoming increasingly touchy about having Western tunes performed publicly as detente proceeded. Restaurant bands, and sometimes even those playing for fairly private occasions, have to watch their step, I was told, because the authorities seed the clientele with informers to double-check the band's performance against its approved repertoire. Once at the Berlin restaurant in Moscow, some friends of ours recognized the band playing the Laura theme from Dr. Zhivago, strictly verboten. After a few minutes, one of them asked the band to play it again. "We didn't play that song," said the combo's leader. "Oh yes," my friend insisted. "I heard it myself, and so did my friends. We recognized it." "No, you must have been mistaken. We didn't play it, and so you didn't hear it." The reply was spoken in that frozen Soviet voice that is less a denial of the actual truth than a rejection of an inconvenient one. Occasionally groups try to defy the authorities or put one over on them, but it rarely works. The Pesnary, a Belarusian group, tried to insist back in 1970 on their own program for a television appearance, and the argument reportedly got so heated that they were not only blocked from that appearance, but a lot of other performances were cancelled until they were ready to submit again. The Kavasari from Bukhara gave Soviet-style protest titles to Beatles songs in their belief. As one musician said, that nobody pays attention to the lyrics, but they got caught, had to trim their hair, were banned from playing at weddings where they had made side money, and faced review of their repertoire. Some music enthusiasts feel restrictions have tightened since the 60s. One avid rock fan told me of wild nights at the evening restaurant on Kropotkin Square in downtown Moscow. In the early 60s, when Beatle music first took Soviet youth by storm, the Komsomol sponsored jam sessions, and the kids went wild, said this tubby 30-year-old. They would scream as if someone were being killed. It was a terrible racket. Furniture got bashed in and windows smashed. So that ended that. Then they used to have the Bluebird Cafe with guards at the door and admission only by special Komsomol tickets. But that had stopped too. In January 74, the Komsomol in Moscow made plans to open a new jazz cafe with live music at the Glass Restaurant in Gorky Park. A writer got his tickets for opening night, but it was called off at the last minute because higher-ups did not approve. The jazz cafe never opened, leaving Moscow without any public place regularly offering live jazz or rock, though several cafes play recordings of Western stars like Aretha Franklin and Otis Redding slipped in among Soviet selections. The conclusion seems inescapable that authorities are less afraid of Western records circulating sub rosa than of genuinely popular homegrown Soviet rock groups. If homegrown groups were allowed real freedom and developed mass followings, they could become even more difficult to control than some big-name writers, athletes, or scientists. Willy-nilly, as an alternative, the authorities have turned a blind eye to the greater leakage of Western rock records sent or smuggled into the country in recent years. So large is the black market traffic in records and other paraphernalia of Western rock culture that one American co-ed studying at Leningrad University compared it to the way pot and drugs circulate on American campuses. The Bolsheviki black marketers are the Soviet counterparts to the drug pushers, the pros, the money men. Some use student sub-agents whose payoff comes in cheap jeans or rare records, and sometimes the police use student informers to trap professional operators. Once, with a Russian friend, this girl was walking in downtown Leningrad. There they are, popped the Russian, pointing to a knot of dark-coated men with briefcases on a street corner, circling each other like dogs, sniffing and checking until sufficient trust was established for actual bargaining to begin. No records were exposed until the title and price had been set. Then a couple of men would ease down the street far enough to feel safe, exchanging disc for money. In their time, LPs of Hair and Jesus Christ Superstar could command 100 rubles or more, usually earned back amply on retapings at 10 rubles a throw. Typically, the contraband entered the country with tourist or returning Soviet travelers. Sometimes records slipped past customs agents or mail censors because someone had thoughtfully tucked them in record jackets for Strauss, waltzes, or Bach cantatas. But never have live Western groups been allowed into the country. As part of the Soviet-American cultural exchange in early '72, the American Embassy proposed the Fifth Dimension, not one of the wildest American rock groups, but sufficiently gutsy to have had a sensational, successful run through Romania, Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Moscow rejected the proposal flatly and asked for something else. Not long afterward, at a diplomatic luncheon, I was sitting next to Vladimir Golovin, then Deputy Chief of Goskontrakt, the Soviet state agency which handles all bookings. When I asked him why the Fifth Dimension had been rejected, Golovin tried to put me off by saying he did not think they were very popular, at least not popular enough to fill concert halls for a 6-week tour of the Soviet Union. Hard to understand, I countered. given the enthusiasm of a young audience I had recently seen in Moldavia for a pop group from the Mari Autonomous region. The entire hall, 1,000 seats, was sold out for one of the milder, relatively unknown professional Soviet pop groups. One cleaned-up Beatles song back in the old USSR, I said, had been enough to bring down the house. The Fifth Dimension are not the Beatles, Golovin sniffed. Well, how do you think the Beatles would go over with Soviet audiences, I tested. The Beatles are already old-fashioned, he parried. They are classics, you mean? No, not classics, I didn't say that. Old-fashioned, he insisted, primly. So much for the Beatles, too. The next day I happened to have an unusual chance to talk with a successful, orthodox pop song composer who said she made a whopping 25,000 rubles a year doing pop-style patriotic tunes for Soviet youth. When I told her the Americans had proposed sending the Fifth Dimension, she and her colleagues were wide-eyed. Would the group have any trouble filling the halls, I asked. Silly question, they replied. Why not have them, I pursued. Ask Goskoncert, said the pop song composer. When I said I had talked to Golovin, they were eager to know his response. When they heard it, they winced at his transparent evasions. Soviet authorities have dared to invite Polish, Bulgarian, and Hungarian combos, and the crowd crush had been immense. East European musicians, one Polish performer confided, regarded these as duty trips to Russia to balance off more desirable trips to the West, so that Moscow will not scold the East Europeans about their allegiance. But what is a chore for them is sheer heaven for Russian youth. The closest thing to a glimpse of the West, indirectly reflected through East European styles and costumes, bolder and gaudier than Soviet homegrown. The authorities, however, remain weary of admitting the genuine article, a big-name Western rock group, for fear of an uncontrollable reaction. The hunger for Western music and the paraphernalia of the pop culture is evidence enough of a generation gap in Russia, a generation gap in reverse, at least among the middle class and the establishment youth, whereas the American youth rebelliously turned to jeans, copping out, and the folk rock ambience in defiant rejection of parental affluence. Precisely what Soviet youth want is affluence and the good life. They are in the vanguard of the new materialism. Young men will take summer construction jobs in Siberia if they can get 1,000 rubles in hard cash, and secretaries will scrimp on food to save money and blow almost an entire month's pay for such Western symbols as easy living as flared slacks, wigs, knee boots, or platform shoes. This trend goes for young marrieds as well as teenagers. Vadim, a young engineer, and Svetlana, a teacher, are typical, though better heeled than most. The hall of their apartment is decorated with bright cutouts from slick Western fashion magazines showing models in leopard skin bikinis and huge moon-shaped sunglasses, jet-set squires in mod sport clothes or swanky modern home interiors. Their own two-bedroom apartment is cozily furnished by Soviet standards, but much more modest. Vadim's pride is a 5-band Grundig shortwave transmitter radio, for which he shelled out 400 rubles, 2 months' pay, and the wide ties Svetlana made for him from imported material. He will happily stand in line for 2 hours for a good Polish jazz record. An original Paul Desmond LP transports him with delight. Svetlana favors bright Japanese scarves and hip-tight slacks, which she makes herself. Anything to break away from the Spartan styles of the pre-war and wartime generations and the general stodginess of their own post-war parents. So far the trend toward modish dress has been mild compared with the peacock revolution in the West. The notion that clothes express the individual personality has not taken root. Russian youths do not sport psychedelic get-ups or deliberately create the freaky look. Moscow has its small tribe of hippies, but most young people know that slovenly dress is an invitation to trouble with the authorities and dare not risk it. The Soviet mod trend continues, mainly of catching up with more established Western fashions. But this fashion consciousness grew visibly during our 3 years in Moscow. When we arrived in '71, university students complained they had to shave their neck-length hair when they went to collect their university stipends, or they would be turned down. When we left, there was still some resistance, but much less, and neck-length hair even occasionally showed up on television, the most conservative of Soviet media. The drug scene, too, made an appearance, not on anything like the American scale, but enough to prompt worried Soviet authorities to tighten up anti-narcotics laws several times, imposing stiff penalties on narcotics rings and repeaters. One set of decrees issued in May of '74 indicated that a major source of illicit drugs was theft from health clinics and medicinal narcotics, and the use of bogus or outdated prescriptions. Privately, a young doctor from Odessa confirmed this. Several times he had been offered hefty bribes for a volume delivery. You could get a new car for it, he said, although he had not gone along. This doctor said such traffic is everywhere, and a port like Odessa, which had a reputation long before the revolution as a bad city. According to him, the traffic fed largely off laboratory technicians who manufactured drugs in government institutes and from other state employees who were swiping hard drugs from clinics. Morphine, he said, sometimes came from war veterans who had become addicted during World War II while being treated for wounds. Under the Soviet health system, they are given booklets entitling them to regular dosages from the state, and either the booklets or the morphine, the doctor said, reached the underworld. In '72, a biologist told me about a scandal at Moscow Institute for Natural Compounds after authorities uncovered some LSD made by researchers there. Not a word appeared in the press, but tough instructions went out to other biology and chemistry institutes to tighten controls against such activities, but this did not halt the trade because a year later an acquaintance of mine attended a party at Moscow University where LSD was in use. More common, however, is hashish from the mountainous regions of Soviet Central Asia or the Caucasus. A young man offered me some, showed it to me in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. Several people in Moscow mentioned its use, and a veteran Soviet journalist pointed out the high-columned Motherland movie theater not far from Izmailovo Park in Moscow as a known trading point. There, he said, a small half-thimble-sized ball of black hashish, enough for one reefer, went for 5 rubles. Yet, despite these and other vague tales of narcotics traffic, the overwhelming impression of Soviet students and foreign exchange students who lived among them was that the drug action on Soviet campuses did not begin To compare with the West, far more of a problem is alcohol, the vodka which Soviet students, like their elders, drink with the same self-obliterating intensity of Western drug addicts who seek oblivion on a high. When it comes to sex, Russia is certainly no land of strolling lovers. Few and far between are the necking or petting couples in parks and other public places. That kind of public display of affection is frowned upon. Candid discussion of sex in public or even in private is virtually taboo. The Western cult of the body simply does not exist, nor for all practical purposes does nudity on stage or screen. One Russian friend joshingly remarked that the biggest public kicks Russians get are sexy pas de deux at the ballet. A man in his 40s recalled his personal shock in '52 when for the first time he saw a modern oil painting of a nude on exhibition, a plump, healthy Russian country maid emerging from the village bathhouse in the altogether, while snowflakes danced around her pink flesh. For our socialist realism, he smirked, amused at the memory, so daring. In one recent and rather candid play about young lovers, Valentin and Valentina, the Moscow Art Theater, tried a fleeting nude tableau after the couple had spent their first night together in someone else's apartment. At the premiere in '71, Prime Minister Alexei Kostyin allegedly felt so offended that he let his views be known, and the lovers were covered up. Other companies performed that play, but no one ventured a nude moment. In another youth drama in Leningrad, the Przhevalsky horse, a pair of young lovers at a Komsomol construction site, got no further than sunning themselves in their underwear on boards 6 feet apart, reaching out to touch hands, and then a fast blackout. One striking exception to this artistic prudery was the scene of mass pagan nudity in Andrei Tarkovsky's masterful film about the Russian icon painter Andrei Rublev, which was delayed by censors 4 years and released only after it had won international recognition. For all the talk of free love in the revolutionary period, what carried the day and still sets the public tone were Lenin's views, which sound like those of a Victorian British boarding school headmaster, deploring what he called excessive interest in the sex question. He wrote, "Young people particularly need the joy and force of life. Healthy sport, swimming, racing, walking, bodily exercises of every kind, and many-sided intellectual interests. That will give young people more than eternal theories about sexual problems. The revolution demands concentration, increase of forces. It cannot tolerate orgiastic conditions. Dissoluteness in sexual life in Burgess, self-control, self-discipline is not slavery, not even in love." Stalin carried forward this Victorian Puritanism, but the public reticence toward sex in Russian life predates the revolution. Tolstoy treated sex gently, as did even so stormy and emotional a writer as Dostoevsky. In his classic works, Pushkin made sexual allusions, but nothing compared to his private life, in which he is said to have kept a detailed list of his own 103 love affairs. From all evidence, there is at least as much Pushkin as Lenin in the modern generation. A Leningrad professor may warn that premarital sex can be a source of severe psychic disturbances and can lead to social impoverishment of the personality, but a sociological survey of university students at the Leningrad University in '69 turned up the results that 85% of the men and 70% of the women had had premarital sex before age 21, and though Leningrad, as a cosmopolitan city, may be abnormally liberal, one social scientist commented that nevertheless the figures are very indicative. Given the shortage of men after World War II, Russian women have gained a reputation for being forward. Tales of village youths being chased by girls and having several affairs at once crop up occasionally in Soviet fiction, and evidently more often in real life. One graduate student in Moscow told me that Russian girls sometimes go to the Caucasus for affairs with dark-haired Georgians, the way some British girls are said to go to Spain, but sleeping together in university dorms is easy enough. For reasons of economy, Soviet universities turned to co-ed dorms long before American universities did. Moscow University, among others, has strict rules against men being in girls' room after hours and conducts periodic corridor searches as a deterrent. But students told me that Soviet student Romeos hide by slipping outside on the window ledge of the 26-story building. Russian roommates are also more tolerant than Americans might be, having grown up in more crowded living conditions. They are housed 3, 4, or 5 to a large room, but as one girl said, co-eds simply turn their backs if a guy spends the night with one of the roommates. People get away with that a lot, she said, so long as the roommates don't complain about it being a nuisance. In some classes, an American exchange scholar told me, the authorities try public shaming to deter sexual affairs by reading out the names of girls caught after 11 p.m. with boys in the rooms. Funny, he added in a very American comment, that would never work in the States. The guys would all laugh and take down the names of the girls. Affairs in working-class dormitory buildings, writers' union hideaways, and hostels are reportedly so common that Russians joke, we don't need prostitution, we have hostels. This laxity reaches down into teenage. A sociologist in Odessa reported in '73 that in a study of 14 to 17-year-old high school students, 25% admitted having had intercourse. The boys had developed what he called an industrial psychology toward sex, which regards love as a physical necessity. A young doctor in Moscow added that with health campaigns having reduced the dangers of venereal disease, with young people living at a faster tempo, and with religion no longer providing moral guidance, promiscuity was naturally on the rise. People have neither faith nor fear, he shrugged. The major problem of the young is finding privacy. Unlike Americans, Soviet youth cannot just check into some hotel or motel. That requires a passport inspection and embarrassing questions about why someone needs a room in his hometown. Floor ladies also keep an eye on unregistered roommates. Most young people live at home with parents, cheek by jowl. Their quandary was aptly conveyed in that play, Valentin and Valentina, which had the two lovers meeting in libraries and subway stations or smooching in elevators. Their one big night came when Valentin got the apartment key of a single friend who had gone out of town. Such frustrations often prompt Russian young people to marry early in an effort to find privacy and independence. By Western standards, the typical Soviet wedding ceremony is pretty plain. Constant demands are made to infuse marriage with more meaning by adding to the wedding ritual, but it still comes across as a tensely assembly line affair. An American preacher considers himself overworked if he does 3 or 4 weddings on a June day, but 30 or 40 is not uncommon on a Saturday at a Soviet wedding palace. Vadim and Svetlana, the couple mentioned before, come from well-off educated families who spent a small fortune on their wedding celebration, even though the parents did not attend the ceremony. Like many Russian girls, Svetlana wanted a full-length, white lacy wedding dress with sleeves to the elbows. Being well-to-do, she had another dress, short, stylish, and wine red for the afterward. Together, they cost nearly 200 rubles at the dressmaker's, and white shoes cost another 30. For more ordinary families, special wedding shops offer much less expensive and not very well made wedding outfits. Vadim was also unusually elegant in a black suit, white four-in-hand tie, and winged collar shirt, all of which cost a pretty penny, but he too was unusual. Most young men come in an everyday suit, a new one if they can afford it, and their regular suit if not. 1 month before they planned to wed, Vadim and Svetlana went to declare their intentions to civil authorities and paid 1.50 rubles to register for a date. They wanted a Friday or Saturday wedding, the most popular because of the following days, and had to wait 3 months for a place in line. On their wedding morning, they went off with their 2 best friends, a girl witness for Svetlana and a young man for Vadim. Sometimes parents also go to the ceremony, but just as often not. There is no tradition of giving the bride away. In Svetlana's case, the young foursome went off alone in a rented taxi decorated with streamers and balloons, but no "just married" on it. Tied to the front grille was a doll. Some couples prefer a toy bear to symbolize their wish for children. Wedding palaces are usually crowded with waiting people, nervous couples doing last-minute primping in an anteroom, and fathers anxiously looking at their watches or complaining to the staff that the rented taxi will leave unless the ceremony gets underway soon. The ceremony lasts only 6 or 7 minutes, but with the mass production line, it inevitably seems to run late. I did not see Vadim or Svetlana's wedding ceremony, but they said it was very much like the ones I saw conducted by Miss Alexandra Suvorova, the director of the wedding palace at 33A, Leningrad Prospect in Moscow. Miss Suvorova, a handsome, friendly, gray-haired lady who is a deputy in the Moscow City Council and an academic specialist on marriage, wore a full-length purple gown for the occasion. Draped across her bosom was a red sash bearing the emblem of the Russian Republic and the legend, "Proletarians of the World Unite." The large, high-ceilinged wedding room was stark and empty, for Miss Suvorova's desk at one end, and behind her a faded mosaic of the Soviet hammer and sickle. A glass vase with red carnations stood on the desk. As the doors at the far end of the room opened to admit the wedding party, loudspeakers played a well-worn recording of Tchaikovsky's First Piano Concerto. 10 feet from the desk, at a signal from a lady in a plain gray suit, the wedding party and the music stopped abruptly. Everyone stood for what was less a wedding ceremony than an official registration of the act of marriage. The Executive Committee of the Soviet of Working People's Deputies of the City of Moscow has empowered me to register the marriage of Miss Suvorova, began an official impersonal voice. The young couples before her, bride and bridesmaid, with long-stemmed flowers wrapped in cellophane, and groom and best man with hands at their sides, looked as nervous and uneasy as young couples all over the world, until the lady in gray called forward the bride and then the groom to sign the marriage papers. Miss Savorova picked up two plain gold wedding bands from a container on the desk, walked out to the young couple, and had them exchange rings without vows. Then warmly and much more personally she spoke to them briefly about the obligations of marriage and the need for mutual love and respect. Do everything together, she told one couple, in happiness and in grief, in hope and in doubt, in defeat and in victory, in all family affairs. Then she pronounced them married, and the lady in gray prompted the young newlyweds congratulate each other. As they kissed gently, the gray lady switched on the recording again. This time a Strauss waltz for gaiety, though more than once she had missed the proper stopping point for the entry march, and the second playing began with a snipped-off snatch of Tchaikovsky, a scratchy pause, and then the Strauss. Miss Savorova shook hands with the couple, gave them their passports, in which the marriage was already registered, and ushered them out. Champagne and sweets were optional down the hall for a fee, but most couples preferred going off to their own wedding parties. Often I saw young couples on ritual stopping at the Eternal Flame for the Unknown Soldier, where the brides laid their flowers, or riding up to Lenin Hills for a view of the city and photographs. Vadim and Svetlana skipped those rituals. I did not want that, said Svetlana firmly. If you go to Lenin Hills on a Saturday afternoon, you see 10 brides in their white dresses every hour. They look so embarrassed. What do you need that for? Either way, the highlight of the day, the time of personal enjoyment and family warmth, is the wedding party afterward. Like many couples, Svetlana and Vadim had their banquet at a private room in a public restaurant, the Crystal Cafe. For hours, more than 70 guests feasted on food and champagne, vodka and cognac, dancing to the music of some of Vadim's university friends, who had an informal pop combo, and singing Russian songs. The poor newlyweds were constantly badgered by cries of "Gorko, Gorko, bitter, bitter," meaning life is bitter, give us something sweet. This is a call for the young couples to rise and kiss to lusty cheers from their friends. For many, this great feasting proves a catastrophic expense. 1,000 rubles is a figure that occurs often enough for the press to run periodic laments of young couples who have gone into terrible debt to finance the partying. Some complain of gatecrashers at restaurants like the Crystal, which run several wedding parties at once. Poorer families economize by partying at home and preparing their own meals for smaller gatherings. The Western tradition of the honeymoon, however, is not so elaborate among Russians. Some couples manage to arrange special travel passes for a couple of weeks. Others take a weekend trip somewhere, but it is equally common, as in Vadim and Svetlana's case, for parents to move out of the family apartment for a few days to let the newlyweds have a home to themselves before all begin living together. The generations may live together for a while, but this does not bridge the generation gap or ease what Russians have called the problem of father and sons ever since Turgenev wrote a novel of that name. The intriguing thing to me about the Soviet 70s was that it was the parents who were worried the materialistic self-indulgence of their children, and who, as members of the establishment, were upset by the political apathy of the rising generation. rather than vice versa, as in the West. In their day, middle-aged Russians lived a hard life, but they were philosophically committed. Now they see their young growing up, spoiled and uncommitted. Our children want everything right away. A buxom matron with an unblemished party record complained to an American friend. Her moral indignation reminded me of the Calvinist code of old-fashioned, self-made American entrepreneurs who came up the hard way and were convinced it had been good for the soul. The young get married these days and they want to have their own apartments and polished furniture, she said. It took us years to get our own apartment. Why should they be in such a hurry? People should wait for these things and then they would appreciate them more, Miss Savarova at the wedding palace told me, with a worried look, that half the couples she was marrying were under 20 and were unprepared to have a family. She considered it one of her main functions to talk many of them out of marrying so young. Another woman, an ambitious, energetic, self-willed writer, born in an old party family, though not a party member herself, felt the younger generation had simply gone soft. I am disappointed in my children, she fretted to me. They are weak-willed, lazy, not self-disciplined. Our son is extraordinarily bright and able academically, but this is not backed by an ability to work or to make a schedule for himself or to sort out what should be done first. I know you Americans regard this as normal for students and teenagers, but at 15 I was already working at a factory, earning my own bread. The response of the young is that Russians have been waiting long enough to enjoy life, and there is no reason why they should have to repeat the hardships of their parents. Young people want to have an openly cynical young government interpreter told me in a Moscow cafe. They don't have time to think, to ask questions. We're at a point, I guess, where you Americans were in the 50s. Young people want to be better dressed, get a car, enjoy the high life. Some parents feel that the materialistic self-indulgence of the younger generation has fostered a disturbing political indifference. I left school after the 9th grade to join the army, recalled a foreign trade official, a party man who often travels to the West and has 2 sons studying at the prestigious Institute for International Relations. I was big and powerful in those years. You know, the young boy who thinks he is already the man. My mother was against my joining the army, but my father was an army officer, and all I wanted to do was go off and fight Germans. My boys don't understand me. When the war movies come on television, my wife and I like to watch. We remember what we lived through, but the boys are uninterested, they say. Oh, again, it's all about this shooting and bombing. Why do you like to watch that? For me it's interesting, but they prefer to go dancing somewhere. All they care about is that modern pop music, which I dislike. They know all the stars, not just the Beatles, that's nothing. I mean the latest stars. Once they met an Englishman and asked him all kinds of questions about stars he never heard of, and they were very disappointed when he couldn't answer them. It seems to me they're crazy over that stuff. I don't understand them. Not only individual parents, but party ideologists worry about ideological backsliding among the younger generation. What Pravda decries as parasitism, nationalist tendencies, inadequate attention to aesthetic indoctrination among youths, or just plain indifference to ideological issues. One sign of the insecurity of the powers that be is the exaggerated play the press gives to statistics that 500,000 young people under 30 have been elected to organs of state power, or more than 20 million have joined the Komsomol. I did encounter university students like the dark-haired Komsomol activist who kept Lenin's collected works in a room for bedside reading and watched when Russians mixed with foreign students in order to step in before fraternization became too easy. Moreover, American youth come away from joint sessions with Komsomol delegations astounded by the dogmatic rigidity of the younger activists, those around 20. The younger ones are really frightening, remarked a dazed, disbelieving American graduate student after a week's seminar. The older ones, nearer 30, know something about Stalin and are a bit more flexible about politics, at least a bit. But the younger ones were absolutely rigid. They may have been putting up a good front for when Pravda trumpets, as it did in the mid-74, that 20,000 young people were enthusiastically trooping off to build the Baikal-Amur mainline railroad in the Far East, or to help reclaim central Russian farmlands during the summer. It quickly adds that ideological work among youth must be stepped up, and privately, a Komsomol leader told me later that only a few hundred of the 3,000 Moscow Komsomol members pressured into signing up for the railroad project actually went. Middle-aged people who are not even ardent party supporters note the loss of idealism among the young. A journalist turning 50, a huge man with wavy hair, an ample belly, and glasses that slid down his nose, recalled his own enthusiasm a generation ago. I joined the Komsomol during the war, he wheezed. We were all excited then. It was a big event in our lives to join the Komsomol, but not my son. It meant nothing to him. When he was nearly finishing high school, I asked if he was going to apply to the Komsomol, but he said, "No, if I try this year, I have to ask them, and next year they will ask me. Better to wait." It was only in his last year at school when someone told him it would help him get into university to be in the Komsomol that he got around to it. He simply went to the office, signed up, and they gave him a Komsomol card. There was a little ceremony, but it meant nothing to him. He was happy if it would help him get into university. And at the Komsomol office, they were happy to get another member for their quota. But in fact, neither he nor they cared. My son was so uninterested that he even stopped paying his dues, something like 20 kopecks a month. My mother-in-law, being from the older generation, didn't think this was right, so each month she would take the bus and go and pay for him. When he got into the university, they told him he would have to do a social assignment in order to get his stipend. So, he said, they made me chairman of the group for training internationalists. When I asked him what does that mean, he said, "Oh, Papa, who needs to understand." That may be an extreme case, but a number of unpublished sociological studies seen by Western scholars indicate that as youth rates itself, ideological conviction is very low. I don't know anyone who joins the Komsomol out of ideological enthusiasm, said a very pretty young blonde who had been a Komsomol leader in a provincial factory town a few years ago. I was an idealist in school, but I changed. Some of the most unpleasant days of my life are associated with the Komsomol. And she rattled off for me the obligatory Komsomol assignments and Sabotniki voluntary working Saturdays she had to put in, checking on other factory workers. The only Komsomol jobs people liked were the construction brigades, because the boys could earn big money, and the Agib brigades because we made up songs and went off to sing them in distant parts of the country. That way we got free trips all over the country. Others said they regarded the Komsomol as the best, and often the only ticket for the young to get trips abroad, to Poland or East Germany, and on rare occasions even to the West. A few spoke of Harvest Brigade work as times of youthful camaraderie, but it was clear that their general apathetic mood was a far cry from earlier years when building socialism was a rallying cry for Soviet youth. Cynicism there is, but rebellion no. By world standards, Soviet youth is abnormally quiescent. The assumption of many a Westerner that political ferment and a dissenting counterculture necessarily ride the coattails of rock music, jeans, long hair, and beards runs aground in Russia. For some youth, especially out in the conservative-minded provinces, neck-length hair is indeed a mild symbol of personal protest. For the children of the elite, Western borrowings sometimes connote rejection of lifelong parental preoccupation with career building and political power. But in the big cities, especially among the educated upper middle class, pop culture imports from the West have become so common and so tolerated by the establishment that they have lost political thrust and content. Jeans in the West are a symbol of protest, observed Alex Goldfarb, a thoughtful young Jewish scientist from a good family, but here they are a symbol of the good life. If you are looking for some kind of counterculture against parents or against the authorities, and you think jeans are part of this, it is absolutely wrong. For you Americans, this all developed organically. Jeans become popular in the West among young people opposed to the war in Vietnam, to the lifestyle of their parents. They are a symbol of poverty, deliberate poverty, because American young people considered it fashionable to look poor, but here the evolution was entirely different. Jeans and the pop culture came from outside. With us, jeans are a symbol not of poverty but of the good life of wealth. That is why they are the most inflated item on the black market. Perhaps they cost 10 rubles new in America, and good woolen slacks cost 25 rubles. But here you find people will pay 75 or 80 rubles for a pair of jeans, 200 rubles for a jeans suit, and maybe only 15 to 20 rubles for slacks made of much better material. Jeans have snob value. Alex paused to let me absorb this idea. We were sitting in his kitchen, sipping very hot, strong Russian tea, and eating chunks of hard cheese. He sipped a bit and then told me of a fascinating confrontation that illustrated how little political significance the absorption of Western pop culture had had. Alex is a sleepy-eyed young man with a bushy black beard, given to wearing a rumpled, slept-in jeans outfit that made him look more like a fugitive from the Berkeley campus than a former research scholar at one of the most prestigious Soviet scientific institutes. He was an active dissident, a Jew in his late 20s who was actively campaigning to immigrate to Israel and confronting official resistance. He was eventually allowed to leave in '75 after I had departed Moscow, but Alex came from a prominent scientific family, and his social connections reflected this solid establishment background. Not too many months before, Alex said, he had been at a party where he met the son of Vladimir Simichastny, former chief of the KGB, a very high-ranking party official with a reputation as a strict hardliner. I was in my jeans, and he, Simichastny's son, was in his jeans, Alex recalled, as they talked casually. The two young men discovered that both possessed records of Jesus Christ Superstar, then the hottest item on the pop black market. The Simichastny lad was wearing his Komsomol pin in his lapel. and when the two talked politics, they clashed. As long as we talked about pop culture, we talked the same language, Alex told me. But when we talked politics, we were completely different. He got so mad at me when I criticized Soviet aid to the Arabs and defended Israel that he told me that if we were in the Middle East and I were there too, he would not hesitate a moment to shoot me, and I told him that I would shoot him too. So there you are. We both had our genes and our superstar records, and it didn't mean a thing except that both of us were from elite families. He from the political elite, and I from the scientific elite. He got his genes through his father's position, and I got mine because my father could travel abroad and get them in the West, but the genes themselves had no political meaning. It was an observation echoed by other young people, talking not only about genes and rock music, but about acquaintances listening to Western news broadcast, or surreptitiously reading the banned novels of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and other underground literature, and yet pursuing conservative, compliant, conformist public lives. They go to work dressed properly, acting properly, and talking properly, as one miscast young editor for a right-wing Moscow magazine put it. Another young man, a Komsomol leader at an academic institute, but a political liberal and a fanatic fan of Western rock music, affirmed his basic loyalty to the established order. When an American friend remarked to him that he sensed no stirrings among Soviet youth against the universal draft, no campus ferment for a greater voice in university affairs, no tendency to debunk their country the way American youth does. This young Russian said bluntly, "Just because we dig Jimi Hendrix, the American rock singer, doesn't mean we are any less ready to fight for our country." The political conformism of Soviet youth is not so surprising given the institutional environment in which they live, for when the stakes are high, as they are at Soviet universities, where only a small minority is admitted to begin building their careers, the system does not tolerate the kind of iconoclasm that the West has come to take for granted on its campuses. Once I asked a British exchange student his dominant impressions of Soviet students at Moscow State University, and without hesitation he replied, "Sat upon." "What do you mean?" "I mean they lack life and spontaneity, not just politically. At MGU there is much less just plain tomfoolery than you would find at any university in the West. The basic reason obviously lies in the general political climate of the country in recent years and in the controls, but the controls are so different, so much more basic, complex, and effective than most Westerners imagine, that it is worth describing the institutional grid in which Soviet youth live and mature. These are not the controls of the KGB against dissenters. That type of control touches an infinitesimal portion of the young. A far simpler, more innocent, and yet more powerful web of checks and controls is built into the Soviet system of higher education and career building. They are a function of the unified, state-controlled system of education. The system provides college youth not only with tuition-free education and modest stipends for living, but also with very structured lives. In rough outline, they go to an engineering school, an agricultural institute, a graphic arts college, a literary institute, and graduate as certified engineers, agronomists, graphic artists, or writers. The economic planners each year put in a quota for each category, and once the students have completed their courses, they are guaranteed a job in their own field. Not only guaranteed that job, but assigned to it. We produce engineers and agronomists like we produce cotton. Gulan Aliyev, the white-haired rector of the Tajik Agricultural Institute, told a group of visiting American correspondents in May of '74, "We have a plan for producing the numbers of specialists which are needed, and we distribute them according to the orders, requests we get." In other words, he explained, the state and collective farms in the Republic put in requests for the trained specialists they need, and these go up through the Planning Commission in each republic, perhaps all the way to Moscow, and come back down to various institutes in the form of quotas for agronomists or water engineers who are parceled out after graduation. It works that way in other fields. When I was in Irkutsk, the rector of the university there told me that the most rapidly growing faculty was the law faculty because so many Siberian cities were requesting lawyers. One reason was, it turned out, that police forces wanted law-trained university graduates to help cope with juvenile delinquency. Actually, the quota system sounds more inhuman than it is. The individual has flexibility in choosing which field he or she wants to compete for and which institutions he wants to try out for. Unlike the American College Board system, which allows multiple applications, the Soviet system requires most candidates to pick one VUZ, higher educational institution, and one faculty in that VUZ for which to take exams. The student puts all of his eggs in one basket. Success means a virtual guarantee all the way into the job market because so few students flunk out of universities and institutes once admitted. But as a university rector in Georgia acknowledged, it is almost impossible to change fields once you enter a faculty. You go straight through in the field you picked before you entered. The curriculum is standard, often centrally determined in Moscow. Electives are few. It is a system geared toward inculcating technical skills rather than being concerned with such liberal arts intangibles as learning to think or personal growth and self-expression. It is difficult to imagine a more direct contrast with permissive, experimental, individual-oriented trends in American education than the uniform, strict, conservative Soviet system, which is focused so heavily on performance and mastering a fixed body of material. Failure at the university examinations is a personal watershed. Usually, it means waiting a year before trying the examinations again. Roughly 7 million students finish secondary school each year, and only about 1 million get into university-level courses, nearly half of them in night school or correspondence courses. Transferring into regular universities from such programs is extremely difficult. Many young men who fail exams are drafted into the Army rather than getting the relative cushy reserve officer training and commission of university students. A lot wind up in manual jobs, though some go to college after the Army, but failure to get in is a blow, for despite all the propaganda about the worker state, Soviet sociological polls among high school students have regularly shown the strong preference for intellectual careers and the low prestige of manual labor, and the experiences of families we knew personally was ample evidence of the intense disappointment of failure since, in many cases, it is an almost guillotine finality. The result is terribly intense competition, cramming and tutoring for university examinations, enormous tensions for high school seniors and their families, a fair amount of string pulling with admissions boards and other educators, and academic scandals about bribery of examining officials, usually in outlying areas, so as not to embarrass important people in Moscow. Theoretically, no one is supposed to be able to approach the rector of Moscow State University, the Minister of Higher Education, or other top officials to influence the admissions process. But, said one pushy career woman who went through an extensive and eventually successful lobbying campaign for her own son, if you could see the reception room of the Minister of Higher Education and his deputy at this time, you would not believe it. Cosmonauts, actresses, journalists, officials, everyone wanting to make appeals. If you try to get into the minister's office, the secretaries, those ladies who sit outside his door saying no to everyone without even checking what they have to say, will tell you it's no use, there is already a crowd in there. A taxi driver complained at what he felt was the unfairness of the system. My kid can't get into university, but the children of the general can, he griped. A general's son gets 5A on the exam, but a worker's son gets a 3C. The implication that grades are all stacked may be unfair, for the government makes periodic efforts to give workers' and farmers' children a better chance. In 1973, the philological faculty at Moscow State University was ordered to take in 70% of their freshmen from the workers' night schools. A teacher told me, according to this account, they managed to find only 40% who could qualify, but the resulting class was so weak that in 1974 they disregarded the social background requirement entirely and went by grades alone, and the workers' family contingent fell way off. Soviet sociological studies through the 60s showed that the children of the intelligentsia had 2 to 8 times as good a chance of making it into universities and institutes as workers' or farmers' children. At the high prestige institutions, the bias is even more lopsided. Richard Dobson, a Harvard sociologist, told me he had read an unpublished Soviet dissertation that showed the trend in favor of the intelligentsia was increasing at Moscow State University. In 1960, it showed that 70% of the students came from educated families, and by 1970, that was up to 80%. Moreover, many students who come from factories or state farms with the financial and political sponsorship of those institutions are sent to technical institutes under the control of industrial ministries and are committed to returning to their factories or farms after graduation. This moment of assignment after graduation, known as napravlenie, is another critical juncture for Soviet youth. It is a time when educational performance, political record, and family connections all come into play, because most young people are terribly anxious to stay in the big cities, where life is more interesting, rather than getting sent out to the provinces. The initial obligatory assignment may only be for 2 or 3 years, theoretically to pay back the state for one's education, but the force of inertia is compelling. The vast majority of people whom I met in the north, in Siberia, or other far-off jobs said that they had initially come on napravlenie and decided to stay. Once in the provinces, they found it very hard to get back to the cities. This process, like the admission process, puts a premium on a clean political as well as academic record. Throughout their university careers, Soviet university students are given compulsory political education, 5 full-year courses in the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, dialectical materialism, historical materialism, the stages of capitalism and socialism, and the basis of scientific communism. Privately, they gripe constantly about these courses and crack cynical jokes, but the political atmosphere makes active alienation and protest unthinkable for almost everyone. I remember one tall, lanky, rather shy teenager who wears horn-rimmed glasses and comes from a prominent dissident family, describing a student meeting at the university which he attended. The military instructor for the class presented a resolution to the class on its socialist obligations, supposedly volunteer duties. After it was read aloud, this young man had raised his hand to object that the resolution said it was approved unanimously. This was impossible to say in advance, he contended, since it had not even been discussed yet. Silence. The others stared at him in disbelief. The military officer denounced him. "How can you talk that way?" the officer demanded. "Are you a Komsomol member?" "No," answered the lad. "I'm not in the Komsomol." "Then you are a Trotskyite," the officer insisted. That was enough to assure unanimous passage without discussion. Our university students are not radical or progressive. They belong to the silent majority, commented a middle-aged mother. They have to be loyal, obedient people, or they would not be where they are, especially at such places as MGU. There are so many ways of putting pressure on them, their stipends, their dormitory rooms, and most important, their places in university. If you realize that only a minority of young people can get places in universities, and even fewer get into real good ones, you understand how much students want to protect their places and not get thrown out. It means protecting a career. Black marks get written down and follow you the rest of your life. Get thrown out of one university and you cannot get into any other. So the students want terribly to stay in, not necessarily for monetary reasons, but out of interest in their field. If someone loves biology or physics or history, he cannot take the risk of being thrown out of a university for any reason, because that means he is throwing away a lifetime. No wonder our students are conformist. Another very important difference from Western youth, which tends to reinforce the political orthodoxy of Soviet young people, is their dependence on their parents and their close sense of family. Before, during, and often well after their college years, many have to live at home because of the housing shortage. Some chafe at this, others regard it as normal, but all know they can do almost nothing about it. The well-traveled wife of one high-ranking foreign ministry official recalled having told her university-age son, much like a Western parent, "It's time for you to go find some work and earn some money and make yourself more independent." But the boy was unmoved. "Okay, Mama, you find me an apartment and I will do it." "Of course, it's impossible to find an apartment easily," she went on. "So he still lives with us in our 3-bedroom apartment. He goes to the university and he is away from home a lot. For 2 months he quit university and disappeared somewhere, I don't know where. But he came back and returned to the university, and of course, he lives with us again. Living at home is crucial. It may create frictions because it makes it harder for the young to find the privacy they want, but it also maintains family ties together longer. It means that parents remain involved in ways that American young people would probably regard as an infringement of their independence. For example, a chemistry student told me he saw nothing unusual in taking his university stipend, paying his Komsomol dues, and turning over all the rest to his mother for the family budget, rather than keeping the cash for himself. Others who live on campus say that their stipends of 40 rubles monthly are not enough to cover room and board, let alone other personal expenses, which several rather well-off young people reckoned at 120 to 150 rubles a month, probably considerably less in the provinces. For the balance, they said, they depended on their parents, another link to the older generation. Moreover, the cultural differences with the West are significant. The youth cult of America has no counterpart here, and the authority of parents remains relatively strong. Soviet students do not knock their parents as much as Americans do. Many young people defer to their parents, consult them about courses, trips, jobs, marriage, and some will fly home to a parental birthday or celebration more readily than would Western students. The importance of family connections, especially in better-heeled families, also reinforces parental authority, especially when young people follow their parents' careers, as so often happens in the Soviet Union. For all this, today's youth generation is more cut off from its own past than any other in Soviet history. It is difficult for Westerners, especially Americans, who have passed through their moral anguish over civil rights, the Vietnam War, and the Watergate scandal, to appreciate what it means to grow up in an historically deaf-mute environment. For the greatest moral issue in Soviet history, Stalinism, has been suppressed, and from all outward signs, the youth generation of the 70s is growing up with a severely stunted historical memory of that time. The party elders have decreed that the Stalinist repressions are a closed book, already dealt with and buried with the party, not to be publicly exhumed. Privately, of course, families talk about the issue, but sometimes the generations wind up on different sides than I would have expected. I remember a tall young Russian, so fanatic a rock fan that he took the incredible risk of sneaking past the armed Soviet guards into the American embassy one night to see the movie of the Beatles' famous Concert for Bangladesh and got away with it. He argued with his father, a party man, about Stalin. Like so many kitchen conversations, theirs rambled, but at one point the dialogue got quite sharp. The son spoke in defense of Stalin's violent imposition of collectivization and the harshness with which he forced industrialization on the country in the 30s, to the chagrin of his father, who was older but more liberal despite his age, or perhaps precisely because he had been closer to the terrible events they were debating and thus knew them at first hand. It was a stunning reversal of the usual roles that Westerners assume are played by the father and son in Russia when Stalin is discussed. I think the country needed a Stalin at that time, the young man Komsomol activist declared. What challenged the father? At the cost of 20 million lives. The son backed off a bit, but held to his basic argument. Well, obviously the terror was excessive and unfortunate, but maybe Stalin had to use such force to pull the country together and hold it together. It was necessary for that time. This case was far from unique. Yevgeny Yevtushenko, now in middle age, told me how he had felt compelled to describe the dimensions of Stalin's terror to a group of young people in Siberia, after one of them rather naively proposed a toast to Stalin around the campfire, knowing virtually nothing about the purges. A senior Soviet diplomat privately told another American reporter, an old friend, that he was astonished at his own teenage son's favorable opinion of Stalin and tried to argue him out of it. What made it remarkable was that the son had been exposed to the West by living there and had been greatly taken with American television, pop culture, and entertainment generally. Other young people are candidly disturbed by how little they know about much of Soviet history, the artistic and intellectual ferment of the 20s, as well as the Stalinist repressions. One young man protested vigorously to the father of a university co-ed he was dating, "We don't know our own past, our political history, our literary history. We have the 20th Party Congress, at which Khrushchev exposed Stalin secretly in '56, but we have never seen the documents, so that we cannot make up our own minds about the past." Some young people, like those around Siberian campfire with Yevtushenko, are unaware even of the extent of their own ignorance of the past, cut off as they are by censorship from those parts of Soviet history which do not fit the party line present. I knew one irreverent young man who kept posted on his wall an old picture of Brezhnev and Chinese Premier Chow En-lai hoisting their hands aloft in a gesture of solidarity. He said his friends were so historically illiterate that many refused to believe it was a genuine picture and suspected him of fabricating a montage. Westerners forgot that far from the scene, they sometimes know more about some Soviet historical events than young Russians themselves. Rarely was this brought home to me more starkly than in hearing about an incident involving Arkady Raykin, the famous Soviet stage comic. He had been hospitalized one winter by a heart attack and was being visited by his 18-year-old grandson, according to a family friend. Suddenly, Raykin bolted upright in bed, startled at the sight of Stalin's closest living deputy, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, passing the door of his hospital room. "There he goes," gulped Raykin to his grandson. "Who?" asked the lad, not recognizing the figure, banished from the pages of the Soviet press almost throughout the boy's lifetime. "Molotov," mumbled Raykin. "Who is Molotov?" asked the boy in stunning ignorance. This historical deafness, one middle-aged scientist remarked, has made this a generation of youth without villains or heroes, except possibly the Western rock stars. It is, he suggested, an Enoch generation, not exposed to moral judgments and moral choices. In that, the generation of the late 60s and early 70s is different from any previous Soviet generation. The Revolution and Civil War period left a distinct ideological brand. The generation of the Spanish Civil War, now in its 60s, experienced anti-fascist fervor and the intimidation of Stalinist repressions, emerging either with a mentality forged by Stalin or an outspoken bitterness against him. The World War II generation, now in its 50s, again felt the clear-cut call of anti-fascism and national patriotism. The generation of the Khrushchev thaw and de-Stalinization, now in their 40s, is now cowed by ideologically unconvinced and privately prepared to render judgments against both Stalin and Khrushchev. It is difficult to get a sense of the Brezhnev generation, the youth generation of Czechoslovakia and Detente. "Our youth is alienated," remarked a party journalist, "with 2 grown children. They want to think over their problems without consulting us. They are introverts compared to us. We were extroverts. We started with the Spanish Civil War, and we had the war against Hitler. We knew which side we were on. This generation acts as if ideology were irrelevant. A lot of them think it is irrelevant to them. They have not had any cataclysms. They are not engaged. They are not committed."